Donald Trump is the only president who's decided not to represent the whole country. Everybody knows who Donald Trump is. And I believe and hope they know who we are. We have to let them know who we are.
Joe Biden today holding his first official campaign rally, speaking in Pennsylvania, hitting Trump for lies and making a very targeted pitch on the economy, specifically aimed at the middle class.
The country wasn't built by Wall Street bankers, CEOs, and hedge fund managers. It was built by you. The middle class is hurting. It's hurting now. It's well past time that the minimum wage nationally be a minimum of $15.
Biden also getting the endorsement of the country's largest firefighters union, and early primary polling has him at the head of the pack. And yet, check this out. The majority of Democratic voters, 54%, are still undecided. That might be a good thing. They have time to look at a whole lot of people. Today, I spoke to former RNC chair Michael Steele, who said Democratic voters have a simple choice in this primary.
Do you want to be woke or do you want to win?
Joining me now, NYU professor Christina Beltran and former internet director for Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign, Peter Dow, also the author of Digital Civil War, Confronting the Far-Right Menace. Christina, when I look at Joe Biden and his message today, he went straight after Trump where it hurts, the economy. President Trump won on a populist economic message, saying to the country, the economy doesn't work for so many of you. I'm here to solve that. Then he wins. Now he has completely flipped the script. And with the same exact economy, even a more exaggerated one, he now calls it great every day of the week and doesn't really get challenged on it. When he spoke in Wisconsin, he didn't talk about the economy. He didn't talk about the Foxconn plant because all those big plans aren't working for those voters. Is Joe Biden hitting him in the right place?
I think it's a pretty effective move at this point. I mean, certainly, and it's bothering Trump, which is really interesting, right? It's fun to watch Trump. You know, what he always often does is he just sort of articulates this image of like, well, the stock market's doing great. But, you know, the stock market, there's such a dissonance now between what the stock market is doing and what regular Americans are feeling. But I think the interesting question for Biden is going to be, given his long history with, people used to call him the senator from MBNA, right? He has a long history with credit card companies. And so I think one of the things that's so interesting about Joe Biden is he literally represents, he sort of embodies the last 40 years of the Democratic Party's politics. And so he's sort of a placeholder for a whole set of debates around where does the party want to go? Does it want to go in a kind of more left direction? Does it want to sort of, figure out how to keep and maintain white voters while growing its young electorate, the multiracial electorate? So he's had a really interesting, what he says and his own history are going to be in a dialogue with each other in a really interesting way.
Well, then this takes you right back to what Michael Steele said today to Democratic voters. Do you want to be woke or do you want to win? If you watch Fox News at night, they're not talking so much about Joe Biden. They're not talking so much about Pete Buttigieg. They are painting a picture that Democrats are the far, far left. And your choice is capitalism as it stands or absolute socialism. And that is not what Joe Biden's message is. So when you look at this and when you look at the Democratic electorate, what direction do they need to head in? Woke or win?
See, I want to reject that entire false dichotomy.
Yeah. There you go.
Because if you think of what it means to be far left, you want universal health care, you want fewer shootings in schools, you want people to be able to have a living wage, affordable college. If you talk about what's far right, it's bigotry, it's racism, it's neo-Nazis marching. So this whole notion that we have to worry about whether Democrats are moving to the left, let's ask ourselves why Republicans are moving so far to the right, which they are.
Yeah.
But do you not have to ask that question yet until you get to the general? While you're in the primary, how difficult is it? When you look at what Democrats are talking about with regard to Joe Biden's conduct and Anita Hill, he did apologize to Anita Hill, but she said that wasn't enough. Yeah. Clearly, that's become a hot topic for Democrats. But if Joe Biden or any other candidate on the left makes their way to the general, no Republican would ever bring this subject up, given who President Trump is and what he himself has done.
Right. But I think we can't even really have this argument based on what the side of Trump is. And we have to know that, like, the right is going to pin whoever gets this nomination as a socialist, as a far left radical. I mean, the attack on whoever gets this gig is going to be fairly hostile and aggressive. And so I think at the end of the day, what there is happening right now, and I think it's actually really healthy for the Democratic Party to have a real reckoning with where do we want to go? What is our relationship to democracy and capitalism? How are we thinking about these questions of racial justice? What is our history with the banks, with corporate power, with policing? We shouldn't be afraid to have real conversations about that's what primaries are for, is to have serious arguments about the direction of a political party. And I don't think it should be framed in this sort of, well, it's identity or it's, the mainstream. That isn't really what's happening. We're having a really serious conversation about where have we been? Where do we want to go? I think one of the interesting questions for Biden and Trump is it going to become too much about just Biden and Trump versus us, right? It's going to be about the future, about climate change. So one of the things that's going to be interesting for Biden, because he literally does kind of embody the last 40 years of the Democratic Party, is, are we going to spend all our time talking about, the Neil Kinnock plagiarism? Are we going to spend all our time talking about Anita Hill and, the crime bill? Or are we going to talk about where we want to go? And is he going to be able to kind of turn the conversation to the future and also kind of remind people of, I was Obama's wingman? How is he going to be able to kind of forge that combination of a conversation?
If we do that, if we go through everything Joe Biden or anyone else running who's an elected official, if we go through every decision, every vote, everything they've said over the last 40 years, isn't that going to take us right back to the last election where President Trump didn't have to answer for any of that because people just said, well, he was a private citizen, and we went through everything Hillary Clinton did. So if this happens again in the next election, doesn't that say, man, experience, that's a negative thing?
So, see, the way I see it is that we have so many false dichotomies out there. One of them, for example, is that going after Trump is different from pushing issues.
Right.
But going after Trump for Democrats, progressive leftists, is going to defend the rule of law. And that's just as important as promoting policies, too. And one other thing I wanted to say, Stephanie, is that, leaders lead. Moral leaders lead. They move the electorate with them. And one of the complaints I've had, I'm a Democrat, but the complaint I've had against Democrats for 20 years is you poll and you pander.
Yes.
And that is not a way to lead. You can move the public toward democratic and progressive issues if you lead and you have the courage of your convictions.
I always think you have to expand the terrain of the sayable. Once you actually start talking about issues, the public is a dynamic institution of people. The public is dynamic. It's not this static thing. Right. And the kind of polling and pandering and keeping your finger up for the wind doesn't really acknowledge the way that leadership does actually always shift the debate and expand the conversation. And so just playing to where we are. We also need to expand the electorate, right? We need to grow the voting. So we really have to, we shouldn't just be talking about the fish that we can catch. We have to grow the amount, we have to grow the fish.
How do you address the poll and pander tendency at a time when we live in social media? When there was the New York Times poll out this month that the actual Democratic electorate, what they want, what they need is far different from what social media would tell you.
Well, I'll give you a perfect example is impeachment. I've argued very forcefully that if any president ever should be impeached, it's Donald Trump. But public polling actually is a little bit dicey on it. It's not 100%. But my argument is, look, you don't always lead by following polls. You don't lead by what the public wants, and you certainly don't lead by what happens on Twitter.
But isn't that
you do
also
what's ethically right and politically right and legally right?
When we ask the public, we're not asking the right question. They're saying they don't want impeachment because they're given the option, do you want him impeached, or do you want people to work on policies that'll help you live a better life?
Yeah.
Is that why they're saying they don't want impeachment?
Thank you. Framing is so critically important. If you look at just about every major debate, and I talk about it in Digital Civil War, my book, which is coming out tomorrow, and thank you for showing it to the audience. The problem that we have here is that we talk about issues that are all on the far right's turf. When we talk about immigration, we talk about should we be caging babies? When we talk about guns, should we be arming school teachers? All these conversations are on the terrain and turf of far right messaging and narratives. Democrats have to learn to bring the conversation back to common sense. Everybody wants clean air and water. Nobody wants kids to be shot in schools. These progressive democratic issues are solid and strong and have large majorities that favor them. But Democrats do not know how how to, too often, not all Democrats, I don't want to paint it with a sweeping brush, but they have to learn how to move that conversation back to common sense.
Right. It's not just about consumption. I think there's kind of a consumer logic when we talk to voters as opposed to a civically, like you want to engage in civic education, right? And I think the other thing, and this is why a really good, healthy primary is important, is that there's a debate in the party of whether or not we're about restoration and kind of getting back to normal, or whether there's actually something fundamentally broken in our politics right now and broken in our democracy. And so we need to have a real conversation about what do we need to fix? What do we really need to repair? What do we really need to deal with? And those are different kinds of conversations, and those shift the debate because it's about whether or not what we have is actually broken, which led us to the election of Donald Trump.
Maybe it's time to create a new normal. Thank you both so much.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.